Icy Hot Pro with 2 max strength pain relievers. Targets multiple pain receptors. Ice works fast. Heat makes it last.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight?
Aha!
Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Wyatt, the protagonist from Brandon Taylor's latest novel, Minor Black Figures, is in an artistic rut. His paintings and photographs of Black life, decontextualized from recognizable American contexts, are read as out of step with his peers in the contemporary art world of New York City, particularly those who make money and a life from their work. When Mango Wave, a collective of young artists that Wyatt sees as running an all-too-familiar identity grift, makes a splash and sells out at an exhibit, Wyatt retreats into introspection about his work and his value to a society that would like to confine representations of Blackness to recognizable tropes. It is at this point that he meets Keating, a gay, failed seminarian with whom he begins an intense physical and intellectual relationship. The two will engage each other in a philosophical grappling match as their desire begins to catch fire. They discuss the role of faith and belief at a moment when such things are best understood by their hypocrisies. They talk art and its power and fragility, and they take in the city in high summer, lovers on the verge of something substantial. When Wyatt begins to investigate the work of a forgotten Black artist, he's called to question the very constitution of his identity as an artist, while recommitting to a conception of artistic freedom that is at times at odds with the tide of Black political life. Minor Black Figures, much like Taylor's much-beloved Booker Prize finalist Real Life, draws its power from the intersection of physical and metaphysical life, and it does so with humor and with an eye for the ways in which intimacy allows us to embody and understand more completely the contradictions that make us whole. A major work from a young writer who's just beginning to reveal the complexity with which he understands the figuration of life in literature, Minor Black Figures runs at the pace and thrum of life in New York City while calling upon dialectics much older than the city itself. Brandon Taylor is the author of the novels The Late Americans and Real Life, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a Science Plus Literature selected title by the National Book Foundation. His collection, Filthy Animals, a national bestseller, was awarded the Story Prize and shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. He was the 2022-2023 Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow at the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. A very warm welcome to Brandon Taylor.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. That was such a moving introduction. I feel like I understand my book better now for having listened to you talk about it. I'm sort of astonished.
My goodness, well, that's so nice of you to say. And It is a book that will be living in my brain for a very long time. I just absolutely I reveled in the conversations that Wyeth and Keating have. And I want to start by talking about your choice to have this particular narrative voice and style. I mean, Minor Black Figures is a novel all about the tacit and understood limitations placed on Black art and representations of Black life. And you put us in perhaps the most recognizable novelistic form of voice and narrative of the novel, free indirect discourse. Why was this the voice with which to give us Wyeth's world?
I think, I love this question. So as you know, I love to nerd out about POV and
You do.
free indirect discourse. And it's the Jane Austen in me. What can I say? I think in part it came from a desire to both want to be incredibly close to Wyeth and to have access to his subjectivity, but also to preserve the ability for the novel to occasionally speak with the voice of the world and to very occasionally be able to sort of, have the novel speak with the voice of the world, but to sort of make that voice of the world one person somehow at the same time. And so it's just such
a magic trick of free and direct.
Exactly. Your sort of plausible deniability. Is that the voice of the god of the novel, or is that just this character's interiority? Who can say? But there's something like quite magical about that to me. Like the way that the sort of ambiguity of that and not knowing if that's like what the novel thinks is like capital T truth, or has the novel slipped back into Wyeth's perspective, right? And so it reminds me at least that the novel is always a kind of subjective form. And it feels like a form that's like quite, I don't know, like natural to me as like a millennial who maybe spends too much time online.
Say more about that.
Well, there's just something about how like social media is a form that is dominated by like visuals and video and where even if you're sort of taking a video of your own face, like it's a third person that's also kind of sneakily a first person, right?
Yeah. Wow.
And
I've never thought of it in that way.
And even when I'm writing tweets, I'm of course like writing them like as myself, but like I've slipped inside of some persona that's also a character. And so it just kind of, I don't know, it feels like free and direct is kind of the way that we operate online and on social media. It's kind of the default narrative mode. And so it's just like, I don't know, it's my default somehow. But I did have like more formal reasons for it, which was that I felt I needed to be able to be both subjective and also to occasionally slip out into sort of wider vistas, right? And free and direct lets you do that. You get both the sort of objective, but also the deeply personal.
That the kind of perhaps organicness of the millennials' use of FID is going to be so fascinating for my colleague Kasia Bartoszyńska, who's writing a book on FID, and she's going to want to quote that for sure. This is an intellectual novel, but I would say very pointedly that it is not inert or cold in the way that some, what I would call intellectual or philosophical novels of a certain tradition can be. And particularly as it concerns the ways in which Wyeth and Keating consummate their relationship as equally a sort of physical and metaphysical one. Sex and ideas are interwoven threads of the same notion of shared intimacy. How did you go about negotiating the sort of the feel of that dueling intimacy?
Well, I mean, the truth is that I really love French movies. I really love the films of Eric Rohmer and Maurice Pialat, and I love the sort of French cinematic tradition where the people seduce each other by talking and arguing about ideas and about these like existential questions while they're walking through, like empty streets or they're sort of roaming about. And so when I set out to write this book, I wanted to write a book where people talk and fall in love by talking and fall in love by coming to know each other somehow. And that to me felt like not revolutionary because Meg Ryan movies exist, but Like it.
And Before Midnight, one of my
Oh,
favorite
yes.
walk and
Oh,
talks.
oh my God, I love a walk and talk movie, right? And I
Me
felt
too.
somehow that like I had been reading a bunch of contemporary literature where the characters were just like not talking anymore, and not to sort of bring up Georg Lukács this early in the conversation, but like one of the like one of the things that Lukács talks about in both his articles Physiognomy, the intellectual physiognomy and characterization, and Narrate and Describe, is that he talks about how in the sort of capitalist bourgeois realism, dialogue only exists to show how isolated the characters are and to show how impossible it is to communicate meaningfully with other people. And I felt like somehow there are a lot of books where people are just like talking and saying nothing and not really comprehending each other. And so I thought, man, I just like really want to write some conversations where people hear what one another are saying but disagree and like have to talk their way to a mutual understanding or to a mutual truce or to like a victory or stalemate or whatever. Like I just like wanted to write about people talking. But at the same time, me being me, I thought, but also like if the characters are people who enjoy talking, then they're going to find it really hot when someone's ideas stimulate them and they're going to want to have sex, right? And
Yep.
those two things will go together as they often do in life. And so I feel like for me, this book was about reminding myself about the pleasure of having those really exciting, invigorating conversations with people whose minds just like set you on fire and the sort of ensuing physicality that comes from that. And it was fun. It was fun to rediscover the pleasure of conversation in fiction, at least for me.
I don't know why the publisher didn't put a subtitle, a walk and talk in a anti-Lukácsian vein, right there.
Listen,
Instant bestseller.
I would have picked it up. I mean, but
Yeah, me too.
I have the Lukácsian sickness. What can I say?
Well, I love that, and I love a reinvigoration of the idea of talking, hearing one another, and disagreeing, because that certainly is a great description of Wyeth and Keating, and it feeds their desire, which is always equal parts intellectual and physical.
And I think just like one more thing before we leave that topip is like they ask each other questions, right? Like they ask each other,
which is a dying
questions.
art, right?
Well, I mean, not for you. You're keeping it alive with the pod, right? But you have two people who don't know everything about each other, who ask one another questions and ask one another to elaborate. Hey, what did you mean by that? Or like, don't you think this? Or what do you think about that? And I find that that's like one of the most attractive traits in a person, but also it's like such a moment of vulnerability to sort of reveal that like you want to know more, right? Like it's the sort of anti-chill. I think maybe part of why conversations feel so staid these days in whatever media form is that everybody's so afraid of being like non-chill that they're afraid to even ask a question. And I had fun. I had fun writing to people asking each other questions and wanting to get to know one another.
Yeah, and hard questions too. I mean, we'll get to some of them soon, but these are not like chill questions. These are definitely anti-chill questions.
I mean, I think one of the questions, like, Wyeth asks a question that he thinks is like fairly simple, and Keating is like, there have been holy wars fought about that very question. That's not an easy question.
Well, that's another thing that I admire and wanted to talk to you a little bit about, is that you are someone who wants your characters to believe that there is more of a context to questions than just the imminent now, that there are histories of conversations about these same things. And I feel like what gets lost in a lot of contemporary fiction is this idea that characters are discovering a question about humanity or history or politics or culture for the very first time. And neither Wyeth nor Keating believes that they're doing that. I wonder if you'd talk about like what it means to have a history of ideas enter a conversation.
I mean, this is the thing I feel. Talk about the Lukács of it all. Like I feel so passionately about this, and I also teach creative writing, and it drives me bonkers when my students I got a student writing a book about a pop star, talk about like a historically determined career and life. And she's writing a book about a pop star. And I was like, when did she become famous? And the student said, I don't really think about that. I don't really want to think about that. And I was like, well, if she became famous in 2008, that's one thing. If she became famous in 2010, that's another thing. If she became famous after the invention of iTunes, that's yet another thing. And like actually does, like it really does matter, right? And I think it's one thing for your character not to think about it, but for the author not to think about it. And I think like for these characters, it just felt important that both of them, you know, like one's a seminarian, one's an artist, like both of those people, there's no way for them to do their work without being deeply aware of the traditions, modes, and like legacies of various ideas that have like preceded their practicing of before. There's just like no way to be an artist if you like don't know like what realism is or modernism or like what the various isms are and how they're interacting. And I just think like there's too much recency bias. There's too much ahistorical fiction. There's too much fiction unfolding in a sort of vacuous, like non-historical moment. And it feels to me like quite dangerous somehow. Like it feels like the fiction of this era, if we don't sort of get our heads on straight about this, we're going to end up writing a fiction that is totally deracinated of any sort of social valence, any sort of political valence, any sort of human valence. And then what will you have but a series of like, what does Lukács say, like a compendium of sensorial data? And like, what good is that to anybody?
I mean, amen to all of that.
Not to get carried away, not to get carried away about it.
No, I love it. And one of the ways in which characters, particularly Wyeth, is engaging with a deep time history of ideas is in thinking with and engaging with the idea of embodiments of Black lives as figurations in visual art. And Wyeth balks at having his work either be co-opted into a presentist political vision of Black suffering or, you know, at the same time feeling pained in the ways in which he's seen as perhaps having turned his back on history. And I wonder if you'd read a scene that really gets to this conflict for us.
So Wyeth is in the midst of researching this obscure Black artist named Del Woods. And Del Woods has been in a show called Negro Figuration many, many decades ago. And Wyeth is thinking about how like questions of Negro figuration then are kind of unchanged from the questions around Negro figuration now. And he feels kind of depressed about that. He feels somehow depressed by the fact that these questions haven't changed very much, despite much social progress happening. And so here we are. The second feeling was crushing sadness. When he thought of those early crits at UW-Madison, when he'd been painting Black men and women into Romare movies, doing a kind of riff on genre painting, at least in his mind, and when his classmates had accused him of turning his back on the history of that moment, the Black martyrs made in the streets as innocent Black children were murdered by the police, he recognized in that dynamic some of the tension explored in the Negro Figuration show. It seemed that Black artists had gone from trying to expand the possibilities of the Negro figure to rigidly and strictly policing what was and what was not politically valent with respect to that figure. It was sad both because they were in some ways fighting the same fight, trying to carve out a space for Black subjective experience, freedom for Black people to paint what they wanted, and also because they were fighting that fight with fewer tools and narrower vision, depressing beyond belief. He didn't want to paint his cousins amid the pecan groves or the peach orchards. He didn't want to draw them riding in the back of the brown pickup truck while his uncle drove. No, that was boring. He wanted to paint them in the beautiful homes he saw in magazines that he read and sometimes stole from the Winn-Dixie. But he'd learned about the Black figure and read poems about Black bodies and been accused of creating unrealistic and incoherent images. Black people on the Breton coast, Black people outside of a stone house in a rural suburb of Paris, Black people rendered in a beach scene a la Boudin, as though one needed to explain the presence of Blackness in a tableau, as though Blackness couldn't exist except under exact aesthetic and historical conditions. Even when he tried to free himself of these considerations and achieve a pure subjectivity, he was stuck on the idea that to render a black figure was to render it from the outside, and that was a kind of objectification. Could one achieve that objectification of the black figure without recapitulating violent and hegemonic ideas or themes or tropes? Was any painting of a black person of violence? Could there ever be a painting of a black figure that was not reenacting some gross historical harm? Was the very desire to create a black figure outside of history itself a reflex against gross historical harm? Did white people have that same baggage? When Wyeth had painted white men, he did not think of that. When he looked at white men, he had absolutely no qualms about objectifying them. He did not fret over the delicacy of their souls or the possibility of their figure being a site of gross historical harm. He was mostly concerned with the play of light on their shoulders or in their eyes. When he saw them, he did not, for example, think of the 30 Years' War, though perhaps he should have. Maybe his paintings would have been better if he'd thought of that. It was interesting, this idea of painting a white man with the same set of considerations of violence, history, and/or objectification, which were usually imported into the figuration of black people. That, Wyeth thought, was true Negro figuration, not the depicting of black figures, but that any figure depicted with the set of considerations normally reserved for the black figure could itself be made into a black figure. He thought of the reference photos he had taken of Keating. He thought, too, of what Bernard had said at the idea of Wyeth painting Keating, painting a white man he'd fucked, how typically faggot. It was true. There was an awful lot of that going around these days. Gay men painting men in their dicks, gay men depicting the nude male form in increasingly subjective styles, and indeed ugly, as any means to counteract what, exactly? Wyeth was not sure. There had been very little of that in his art school. Well, that was not true. There had been that, some, not as much, but now it seemed that all the gay male painters his age were reacting to some sort of hyper-conservative frequency that only they could hear, and that their chief means of combating this projected ghost of conservatism was to paint men they thought were hot or beautiful or whatever. It was so tedious. And yet, Wyeth thought about texting Keating and saying that he was serious about painting him. Not because he was attractive, though this was important naturally, but because Wyeth felt that he could do something with him. He wanted to paint Keating. He wanted also not to inspect his desire to paint Keating too closely, partly because he was afraid he would find a set of shallow motivations, partly because he was afraid he would find that he was motivated by a set of relations he could not escape, chief among which was a black faggot's tendency to want to make art about white men he desired sexually. It would have been more interesting, Wyeth thought, to try to paint Keating from memory, from the memory of last night, and to let the natural haziness of memory do its work. But then, that was Proust. Also the priest thing, the Jesuit thing. Wyeth was not sure, strictly speaking, that he had not committed some sort of spiritual crime. Was there a special punishment for sleeping with someone who had taken vows? Was that not one of the graver spiritual infractions? He did not text. He went back to his internet search.
The holidays are coming up, and I have relatives and friends visiting, and that means I need to put them up. Happily, I have a couple of guest rooms. Unfortunately, these guest rooms need help, and I go for help to Wayfair, because Wayfair has everything that you need to spruce up your guest rooms and also your bathrooms and so on and so forth. Wayfair is really your one-stop shop for all of these things: bedding and linens and throw pillows, accent chairs, towels, cookware, plates, utensils, you name it, they have it, and they can get it to you quickly and free because shipping is free at Wayfair. Now, I personally bought a couple of comforters and some pillows for my guest rooms, and it was extraordinarily easy to order them. They came in a few days, and as I say, shipping was free, so this saved me time, and I just had a great experience. So Wayfair makes it easy to tackle your home goals this holiday with endless inspiration for every space and budget. Free and easy delivery, all your seasonal must-haves. So get organized, refreshed, and ready for the holidays for way less. Head to wayfair.com right now to shop all things home. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Thank you so much. It was beautifully read, and it gets to so many of the big questions in this novel, and wonderful to hear it in your voice. But I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you think through in the novel the nature of wanting to avoid the constraints of representation and the what seems to be the forcing of hands to have particular contexts, particular aesthetics, especially for Black artists, and to have the conflict then being that there is always the lurking sense of objectification and violence in any representation of Blackness in a contemporary context.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great inescapable double binds, I think. I think for many Black artists, not just in visual arts, but also in prose and cinema and film, at least in this country, I can't speak for other countries, but to create art as a Black person in America is to have an audience that arrives sort of already imagining that they know what it's about. They already have in their minds what is and is not acceptable, what does and does not constitute Black art. And they measure you against that. And that is a set of, measurements that have virtually nothing to do with the artistic quality of the work itself. It's like you're being measured, against some external standard of like Blackness. And if you deviate too much in either direction, you're sort of chastised for it, right? And one of the sort of Black critics' favorite lashings to give a Black artist is, oh, they made that for white people, without asking themselves, like, what does it mean to sort of make art for Black people consciously? And like, what is at the heart of that impulse? Which is ultimately like what I think like this book is about, like this question of like, does a Black artist just get to be an artist? Do they get to just make art? And what motivates them to ask that question in the first place? Like the book sort of starts peeling the onion, and Wyeth, he starts out being like, I just want to paint my Romare movies with Black people. What's so bad about that? And the book kind of makes him interrogate, well, sure, it's fine if you want to do that, but also why do you want to do that? Like what's that about? Are you so sure that you have purely aesthetic motivations? Is there some embarrassment about your race, or embarrassment about your class, or embarrassment about identity? Why do you run from identity so much? And I think in a way, like the book was my attempt to think through my own sort of queasy ambivalent feelings about identity, and how identity enters so much into discussions of Black art in a way that, like, I mean, it also enters into discussion of like white art, but not in this way that feels incredibly limiting to them. And it takes up so much headspace, right? And I just like, I don't know, I wanted to capture that. I wanted to dramatize that. I wanted to move that to the front of the discussion and to show like there are no purely noble ways to ask this question. There is no sort of like purely noble way to make art from an identitarian basis, even if you tell yourself you're doing it for your people. What does it mean to be quote unquote doing it for your people? And why might you be doing that? Like you've bought into that ideology, but like what is at the bottom of that ideology, right? And so the book tries to dramatize all of this, but mostly it's me giving Wyeth a hard time about the things that he finds comfort in, and to sort of force him to talk some of this stuff out, and not just with white people, but to sort of force him to talk it out with other Black artists as well, people who know as much as he does, and to not let him rely on his like erudition, right? Like he can't elegance his way around some of these like thorny questions for which there are no easy or comforting resolutions.
Yeah. I love that as one of the major takeaways. No easy solutions, no easy answers. And there's of course the identitarian aspect, but also a political aspect in an age of just the repetition of historical kinds of state violence against Black bodies. And I was struck by, when I was studying South African literature in graduate school, I read the writer Njabulu Ndebele, who wrote a kind of manifesto for recovering of the ordinary in Black life and Black art. And his argument was that the very representation of ordinary acts of joy and sorrow and boredom was itself political. And this was obviously controversial, to say the least, given the political weight applied to works during late apartheid. And I wondered how you think the novel is engaging with that political, not requirement, but certainly an onus to address that we're in a time of great violence, state violence against Black lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was a different, and I've written a little bit about this, but there was a different opening to the novel that was much more like in scene, and Wyeth outside of a bar watching a rat drag another rat across the thing. And it's, like that scene appears later in the book in a very different form, but it used to be the start of the book. And I thought, okay, but like 2022 was a very tense and nervy time in America, right? Why am I being so hazy about what was on everybody's mind? And if you were out in the street in June, you were seeing the protests, you were seeing people marching because of the overturning of Roe. And it just seemed to me like if I was going to write this book and write it honestly and write it sort of close to the ground, the book had to be able to capture not just like one person's experience, but to sort of be able to say that person's experience is unfolding in this larger context. And part of why his experience is important is because it unfolds as part of everyone else's experience, and you've got to put the political back in there, right? And so it sort of found its way into the opening of the book, and that's why it sort of begins in that sort of grand Dickensian way. But I also think this is something that Wyeth himself thinks quite a lot about when he's wanting to paint Black people in, Romare movies or Pielat movies or Visconti movies. He's painting Black people into really gorgeous apartments, right? He's sort of painting them in these tableaux. And part of why he wants to paint them in these tableaux, his sort of unexamined desire to do it, is that he watches a lot of European film, and those are the settings that his imagination is furnished by. And he feels a bit of he feels a frisson when he sort of puts Black people into settings that, where they don't belong. And I myself have experienced things like that, where when I was in graduate school, my classmates told me that they wanted to know that my characters were Black on the first page. And I was like, well, they are Black. I can tell that they're Black from the first page. I'm just writing, and I had sort of trained myself to write stories based on Ann Beattie and Cheever and Carver and Richard Yates. And so I was just well, I'm just putting Black people in these settings, and you're telling me that you can't parse their Black, that feels like a you problem. So I started, I started calling my Black characters by these intensely Slavic Eastern European names. So that if my classmates wanted to tell me that those names are inappropriate, they'd have to tell me why they didn't think a Black person could be called Vsevolod. Why can't I call this Black boy Fyodor? You have to say that to me. You have to use your human mouth to say to me that you don't think Black people can be called that. And so I sort of took that and gave it to Wyeth, where he's painting these Black people into settings that other people think are incongruous, while his classmates are making art about the murder of Tamir Rice and Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin. They're making this clearly legibly political art, and he's making beautiful fantasias, and they're what are you doing over there? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? And his other classmates are well, he's just painting Black people, so he's doing the same thing as them. And for Wyeth, he's no, I'm just heeding my own subjectivity, but he doesn't even realize the ways that that subjectivity is in fact deeply politicized. Why are you so uncomfortable with their expression of political identity and urgency through their art? Why does that make you so uncomfortable? And so he spends basically the whole book trying to figure out, like, why did I feel so weird about their paintings? And why did I feel kind of insulted when people said that I was being political? And the book opens with him being like, maybe I should be political. And all of his like downtown gay artist friends are like, brother, don't do that. Don't do that.
I mean, speaking of impossible and intractable questions with very long histories, Wyeth and Keating really get into it about faith and religion. And I think it's a vexed question as to where faith and religion live in queer literature, not at all because queer people are not people of faith and religion, but because we live in a contemporary moment in which organized religion is often structured around its exclusion of queer people and its use of language that brings violence down upon them. And having two queer characters from very different racial and cultural backgrounds discuss religion frankly feels like a kind of a political act. And I wonder if you'd frame it in the context of their dialogues.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I made the choice really early on that one of them was going to be a priest. And indeed, when
you
I
just seen Fleabag and you
I mean,
the hot priest.
I mean, I'd always kind of been obsessed with Jesuits. I have this like long history of like getting really into Catholic business, even though I'm not Catholic. I just I know far too much about Catholics. And so when it came time to write this book, I literally made a list of like things I wanted to write in this book. And like top of the list was Jesuit.
That was number one.
Number one was Jesuit. Number two was painter. And in some ways, like Keating was like the first character I had in the book. But I've
always also thought that like the Jesuits are such an interesting anomaly in the history of Catholicism, and
1,000%.
Their desire to just have these kinds of debates and intellectual engagements seems to go at odds with the rest of the church.
Well, and very often Jesuits were oppressed, right? And I had a conversation with a Catholic priest about, because once he found out that I was like really into Jesuits, we had a like long conversation about Jesuits in the 30 Years' War. And what he told me was that a lot of the sort of like legal foundation that would later be marshaled against Jews in Germany and in France was first put into place as anti-Jesuitical laws.
Oh my God. Oh, wow.
It's like this like group of hyper-educated outsiders who are beholden to a mysterious mysterious foreign power, the Pope, who like crop up and indoctrinate children and like educate them and sort of move about in the sort of unruly underclasses. And so a lot of monarchies were not a fan. They were not a fan. And so a lot of, like the Jesuits were in fact like a sort of they were oppressed in some places, but they were persecuted. And part of it is because they were, they were basically the hippies. They were the sort of philosophy professors of the Catholic Church for a while. And so I wanted there to be a Jesuit in the book, but like once you make that choice, then you have this other choice of like, well, they're going to talk about it. Are they going to talk about God, or are they not going to talk about God? I think in a lot of writers' hands, especially my fellow millennials, I think the Jesuit would have been there for like seasoning, but like it wouldn't have become like a topic really. But it felt important that they talk about it, and it felt important that it become a thing, like a sort of active texture in the book. And so they have to talk about God, and they have to talk about, like Keating's beliefs, right? And I, at a certain point, I was like, well, he's like a Jesuit. He's like probably like he's pro-life. Like I can't have him be like a sort of fantastical secular Jesuit. Like there's certain sort of non-negotiables. And so then I was like, well, this is a thing on which they like both disagree about. And so like that becomes a part of the conversation. But I everything that I was like afraid of, like everything that I thought would shut the book down only like deepened it. So like them getting to these intractable spaces over sex, over faith, over bodily autonomy, like those are just like, I was so afraid of them talking about abortion, which is a part of the book. And yet it just like became this I don't know, like the site in the book where something like grace enters in, and where their conversation deepens, and it deepens the book in all of these other mysterious ways. And so I thought, wow, maybe people really should talk more. Like maybe they should. Maybe dialogue is occasionally a useful way to add meaning to one's life.
I don't know. It's fallen quite out of favor, I'm afraid.
And doesn't look like it's coming back. Doesn't seem like it's on its on its way back to us.
No, but maybe I know. Maybe you can make it hot again.
Optimism isn't sunshine and rainbows. It's fixing things, changing the way we fix things. It's running the world on smarter energy. Because if optimism never stops, then change can't either. GE Vernova, the energy of change.
Your earbud fell in a coffee cup. You need a taco pick-me-up. When modern life gets rough, grab the timeless taste you love. Paso, the old El Paso.
You invest a great deal of your writing beauty in the representation of processes for restoring art. Even as the novel raises the question of whether or not restoration gets to be a proper art form to begin with. And I wonder what drove your interest in restoration just in general, but also in representing its craft and art.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. Very, very many years ago, when I had first signed with my literary agent, I was at an MFA program and I was like very confused and very sad. And she came to visit the program to give a talk. And I was like, Meredith, can you just like tell me what I'm good at? Can you just like tell me what my deal is? Like, I feel very confused and very lost and I can't see myself in these classes. Like, can you just like tell me up from down? And she like she like blots very elegantly wipes her lips with her napkin. And she says, well, Brandon, like you make process a plot. Like you write about process. Like that's what you do. You seem to really delight in process. And I thought, you know what? That's so true.
So much in the science of real life. That's so true.
And the dancers and the like. I love a process, and that was just like very clarifying. And so I thought, instead of running away from that, I'm just gonna like lean into it. And when I was like researching for this book, I asked myself, like, what do I want to write about? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to write some painting stuff, but like, what else am I really interested in? And I'm like, I'm really interested in how they clean paintings. I'm obsessed with how they clean them, how they clean paper. There's a shocking amount of water involved in cleaning paintings. Did you know this? They
I've seen video where it's like you're shooting water on the paintings.
Yeah. And they like put it in baths. And I was like, that's crazy to me. I have to know everything about it. And more or less at the same time I discovered that, I also discovered, because I was like trying to figure out an art form for Del Woods to be doing. And I discovered lithography. And one of my favorite painters is Helen Frankenthaler. And she did a lot of lithography that people don't really know or don't really think much about. And so I thought, lithography and restoration are both like incredibly interesting processes. And so for me, if the process is interesting, I'm going to write all about it. I'm going to get in there. I'm going to like, yes, like, oh, you're dumping grated eraser on this? Like, who knew that that's a thing people did? It was amazing. Yeah. Just the material. Plus it was a way, I mean, honestly, the sort of writing craft problem that having process solves, especially like with restoration, is that it keeps you from getting too metaphorical, right? Like it's really easy when you're writing about something like restoration to get swept up in the sort of like figurative language of it all, but also the abstraction of it. Like, yes, I am excavating the past and restoring the thing to what it once was, and like all of that stuff. And you can avoid that by just dealing directly with the materiality of the process. And so instead of writing this like exegesis on like restoration and like Christ and all this other stuff, it becomes like Wyeth rubbing grated eraser on various grades of paper and dipping it into various baths, right? And just like making that process as interesting and as beautiful as I possibly could, just so that I wouldn't spend all of this energy being metaphorical or lyric, where it's really about the rubbing of the eraser. Because the thing is, like, if your mind wanders while you're rubbing that eraser, you're going to like ruin a very
that's it.
painting.
That's it.
Right? when you're doing that kind of work, you're like zoned in. You're like, it's very zen. Your mind is very still, but like, you're not thinking about, yes, you're not thinking these like rhapsodic terms, right? And so it was a nice way to keep myself grounded. And also just like love going deep on a process. I find it fascinating. I love it. I can't get
reading about the process. I did a like deep dive into like 20th century lithography and particularly among, Black artists. And there's such incredible stuff out there.
It's amazing. And what I will also say is that I was doing research and I found out, because I was like going to go try to take a lithography class. And one of the sort of like last masters of like the lithographic process in America was this Black man living in New York City who had a studio like 3 blocks from my house, like 3 blocks from my apartment. And I was just like, this is crazy. I have to know everything about this, right? And, he'd like studied in the Southwest where there was a big lithography hub in America, and he had studied abroad in Paris. And he was truly like one of the last like masters. Like he had worked with Frankenthaler, he had worked with all of these people making their prints for them. And he had a studio literally like 3-4 blocks from where I live right now. And
that's amazing.
And like, that's the kind of feeling I wanted the book to have, which is like the sort of uncanny proximity between the present and the past, and how it's always kind of there. Like you like look at a picture, like an old photo. Like I recently saw like an old photo of like East 60th Street. And I was like, oh my God, I play tennis there every day. That's so crazy. Like that's the place I know that place because I go there every day. And I don't know, like that to me, that sort of feeling of palimpsest, right? Of different temporalities on top of each other. I think like that's one of the things that the novel can do so beautifully. It can evoke that so strikingly and so strongly. And I wanted that feeling in the book somehow of like the sort of like, oh my God, this guy, but also his proximity to me is so high. Like, oh my gosh, I could reach out and touch him, even though he's like many decades gone, right?
That's a beautiful way of thinking about history and the novel. And I also just want to say that you're doing something different with your depiction of the city. I was struck by even just a scene with Wyeth and Keating in Sheep Meadow and looking at volleyball players. Mm-hmm. And your kind of layering of New York City life, I feel like, is working with the city in a different way than a lot of New York City novels are doing. And it felt very true to you and to your experiences as a human in the city. And I wonder how you brought your New York into those scenes.
Oh, that's so kind of you, and thank you so much for saying that. It means a lot to me. And there are a couple just like really wonderful conversations with my editor about this, where he wanted me to scale back on the subway or to scale back on certain moments where he felt like, do we need to momentarily enter the consciousness of the ladies selling candy and mango on the subway platforms? And I thought, no, we absolutely need to, right? Like part of the book's democratic project, right, is this dispersal of focus. Like it's so deeply important that Wyeth on the platform looks at those women and thinks about how they got there to such a degree that the novel enters into their experience and identifies with them, so that he is no longer the center of it, but like they are, and that the book occasionally can like see everybody in the city. And there are these moments, right, where there's descriptions of unhoused people in various places who have their own lives unfolding. And it feels important that the book be able to leave Wyeth and go identify very deeply with those people, so that you get a sense of the city not just from like this person's eyes. He's the main character, surely, but he's a transplant, right? He lives in this city among people, right? And so like it was just like important that the book that it take place in the city. and I mean that in like I mean that in like all the ways, not just that the city is like an inert backdrop, but that the city has people in it. And when he looks at them, they see him back, and that he can see them. And there's this negotiation that it's almost like the book is like almost going to tip into their perspective momentarily, and then it sort of goes on, right? And that was always, I don't know, like, I love that feeling. I love that feeling of like not knowing if one of these random characters on the street is just going to like take the book from the main character. I don't know. I sort of love books like that. Zola does that all the time where like,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
those books will follow a random stranger down any sort of nook and cranny. And
With-
I don't know. And just like as far as the city, like I was like, if it's going to be New York, it's got to be New York. Like it's got to be New York, and it's got to have like the awe that Wyeth feels, like being sort of still new to the city, the awe that he feels at the great canyons of the avenues and the cliffs of all the buildings. But it's also got to have this kind of like steely New Yorkerness about it, where you keep your head down and you like mind your business, you know. But also this sort of like beating heart of generosity, where it's like we're all in this together somehow. And of course, the great metaphor of city life, the subway. Like, how can you not get enough? Like, the subway is so central to life here.
Yeah, it's the veins of the body.
It really is. I'm obsessed with the subway, but also the fact that the subway is always where politicians or pundits go to tell you about their vision of the city. Like a lot of right-wing people or conservatives imagine the subway as this like lawless underjungle, right?
Yeah, right.
And they're like, oh, it's so unsafe. Meanwhile, there are people like dancing and doing circus tricks. Like, they're like, it's actually like very safe, right? And so like whether you view the subway as hell or a kind of like the best of New York, because it is this like great mixing zone, depends on, it tells you a lot about how you view the city and what you think. And so the subway is just like such a useful, figurative, ready-made. It contains all of these like different resonances and meanings depending on the person looking at it. And a lot goes on in the subway, frankly. Like a lot goes on down there.
Yeah. I mean, I have a forthcoming interview with the writer Olivia Wolfgang Smith, whose most recent book is Mutual Interest, and it's a turn of the 20th century historical novel, and one of her characters, who's not named as such, but who definitely has autism, becomes obsessed with the new subway and the subway's, networks and tries to ride it in its entirety when you could early on every day. And there's some real sort of wonderful early subway scenes in it. And
I'm going to have to check it out. I'm going to have to check. That sounds so good.
It's a great novel. I highly recommend it. But yeah, you will like it. So I know from a previous conversation that we've had that some of your first literary experiences were with romance. And you've said before that romance is able to have none of the sort of prudishness around the language of true physical intimacy that so much of literary fiction does. I mean, it's almost become a kind of like a cliche to say that contemporary lit fic is just so bad at sex writing. And you are not. And it's interesting again and again to read your work and to see how you're trying to innovate in the ways that you can talk about sex in literary fiction. And I wonder how you feel this book is moving forward, maybe your own practice of that work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like in some ways this book was my love letter to romances. There's one scene in particular that when I wrote it, I was like, oh yes, I've finally written a swoon. I finally got a character to swoon. And if you've read my previous books, you know that there were no occasions for anybody to be swooning in any of those books. So it felt like that.
Yeah.
No, and so it felt like such. There were all these like sly references to Meg Ryan and When Harry Met Sally throughout the book. Anyway, if my first book was like me trying to rewrite To the Lighthouse, like this book was like me trying to write When Harry Met Sally, and that will make sense to readers when they read the book. So I think in this book I was interested in writing about sex in a way that like wasn't as punishing. I feel like in my other work, sex was always came at such a fraught high cost, even when it was like quite pleasurable. I don't know if the characters were experiencing much pleasure, And with this book, I feel like I just sort of entered into a different understanding of like what is possible between two people. And I wanted the sex to be a deepening of intimacy, but like also just like a deepening of intimacy that was not the foreclosure of questions, but like opened onto new questions and let the characters ask more of each other with their bodies and also just like letting them enjoy it. I think letting the pleasure back into the sex writing, letting the sex be warmer, be more playful, be more intimate. That was fun to do because I felt somehow that like that aspect of sex, the playfulness of it, the sort of playful curiosity of two people trying to like figure out, like, what do I like? What do I like with this person? What are we going to do next? And also the fact that there is a relationship here in the book means that I get to show their sex and their physical intimacy evolving over the course of a novel. And there are kinds of things that I got to write in this book that I just like literally had no reason to write in the other ones. Like there's no hand holding in those, no one's holding hands in the first three books. And so I think, like this book, I consider the book where I discovered like a new terrain of like tenderness and intimacy. And it's not that it's like a sappy book, though there are sappy moments that I take great pride in. It's just that the characters got to like each other a little more and that the sex was less of a battleground. And that was fun to discover, to discover that I could write that and to sort of, because it brings its own aesthetic questions. Because it's like, you don't want to want it to be boring or like gauzy and like tender, like, ooh, they're so tender to each other. Like it's got to have some heat to it, right? Like you've got to find a way to keep it interesting and sexy and exciting to the characters themselves. And it's not just like, oh, let us just like very tenderly brush our fingertips over each other's faces for 5 pages. Like
in that case, you might as well just have them like make each other some oatmeal.
I know. Or like just like do a fade to black, brother. Like it's not worth it, right? So it's gotta have some physicality and interest and heat to it. And so that was a fun balance. And it, again, like it's just like I didn't have an occasion to ever have those thoughts with my first 3 books. So it was fun to discover them with this one.
Well, and audience members who haven't read The Late Americans or Real Life will discover soon enough why that is, and for a very good reason.
Yeah. I mean, I did what I needed to do in those 2 books, but it was nice to need to do a different thing in this one.
Brendan, before I let you go, I'd love to know a little bit what you've been reading and loving recently. If you have any recommendations for us.
Oh my gosh.
You read just like a crazy person. So I'm excited.
You know what?
To hear.
Like people often say that I do. And I'm always like, what are you talking about? I don't read. And then I like look back over my like camera roll for the month and I'm like, oh, I read so many books. I have 2 kinds of recs here. So in my sort of like daily life, what I'm reading for pleasure, I read a recent novel called Muscle Man by Jordan Castro, and it's about a lit professor who is like stuck in a faculty meeting and all he wants to do is be in the gym lifting. And it's like a Bernhardian riff on that. But it's so funny and so wise and like weirdly very gay and like spiritually like active with questions of like meaning and all this other stuff. It's so good and it's so funny and it will go by really quick. So I recommend Muscle Man by Jordan Castro. And then on the other side of that is like this great book called Herculine by Grace Byron, which is about a trans woman in New York who goes to her ex-girlfriend's commune, and it turns out they may or may not be summoning demons. And it's, again,
the answer is definitely yes.
1000% they're summoning demons. But it's just like so smart and so philosophically and spiritually active, but also like irreverent and cool. And it just like gets being like queer and trans in New York. It's so good. I love it. And then on the flip side, I'm teaching a class on ideology this fall in New York, the ideological basis of fiction. And the first 2 novels that we're reading for that
class,
we're having a lot of fun. The first 2 novels that we're reading for that are Émile Zola's Thérèse Raquin and Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. And I had forgotten how messed up those books are. They're both bonkers and so good. They're both really, really short books, but they're so good and would make like a really good prestige series, but for different reasons each one. But so if you're like looking for something just like dark, that's going to make you be like sad in like a really pleasing way, like listening to like Fleet Foxes or Billie Eilish, then read Ethan Frome and Therese Raquin. They're both, so juicy, so good. And
that's so exciting. I read Ethan from ages ago, but now I have to return to it. And I just,
No, I was just going to say, like, this is my first time reading it in like 3 years. And oh my God, what a crazy book. I had forgotten I had forgotten some things at key moments. I had misremembered them. And I'm just like, oh, this is so much more messed up than I remembered.
It is, it in many ways defies the expectations of novels of its time, I think. And it is quite bizarre and wonderful and weird and definitely I think it's calling me back now. It's funny that you bring up Fleet Foxes, because I think it was you on social media who was describing the adaptation of The History of Sound as if some guys from a 1920 literary magazine were listening to Fleet Foxes. So
yes. Yeah, like it is like, if you ever wonder what like what it'd be like if Josh O'Connor and Paul Mescal dressed like they edited a small literary magazine and sang covers of Fleet Foxes songs complimentary, then this is the movie for you. And I stand by that. Like it really is. They look like they edit The Drift or like Plowshares or something. Like the outfits are exquisite, and the Fleet Foxes vibes. Like one of the first songs that they sing is a cover of Silver Dagger, which is of course like a folk song that Robin Pecknold covered during his era when he was promoting Shore, the Fleet Foxes album. And it's an amazing song, and Robin Pecknold of Fleet Foxes does an incredible job, and Paul Mescal also does a great job. And the minute I left that screening, I just put on Robin Pecknold singing Silver Dagger all the way home from Lincoln Center.
Well, can we put this as an extra recommendation? For you?
Heck yeah. Okay. I recommend.
Awesome. Well, what I want to recommend most of all is the latest by an author whose work I really love and admire, and it's Minor Black Figures, a novel unafraid to have characters have conversations about ideas with long histories and not come to consensus on those ideas, but rather find that perhaps the hottest thing about intimacy with one another is talking about things upon which you disagree. And it was such a pleasure to get to talk to you. You're such a great interview, Brandon Taylor, and I hope we'll continue to get to talk in the future.
Yeah, I can't wait for the next one.
Me neither. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Brandon Taylor for coming on to talk about his latest novel, Minor Black Figures. You can find links to purchase Minor Black Figures and all of Brandon's recommendations on the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.